I don't. Okay, there. Now, let's talk about political power. Then we'll talk about political force. And we're going to talk about what gives people power and then the absence of which compels them to use force. But first, let's figure out what power is. What's power? Political power. Now, see, there's an example. Bryce, do you have your hand up? Because I can just like the very top of your head.
Yeah, my laptop is weird, but your rant on cameras made me want to turn it on for you.
Smashing. It's not a terribly aesthetic perspective, but at least we know you're there. What's your comment or question?
I was just going to say that power is influence in a way.
Is it influence in a way, or is it influence?
The ability to influence.
The ability to influence what?
Anything, an institution,
outcomes.
A group of people.
Yeah, outcomes. The idea is that power, the exercise of power is goal-oriented. The exercise of power is intended to achieve something. And as Jackson suggests, I think Jackson, that was you, suggest you're trying to influence an outcome. Remember when we were talking about politics and we talked about it in the context of public outcomes and the process through which we achieve these specific kinds of public outcomes. Well, your ability to influence a desired outcome in that decision-making process is evidence of your power, okay? So Bryce was not wrong, just a little bit imprecise, and we want to be as precise as we can. So the first thing to think about with political power is that it is the capacity to exercise influence over a desired outcome. This is what we want, or what I want, in terms of an outcome, a public outcome, not just I want money. It's like, I would like, let's just say, I'm even older than I am, and I'm President Biden, and I'm even slower than I am, and I'm President Biden. And what I want is the passage of this, whatever, $1.5 trillion, infrastructure legislation, these significant program investments in, bridges and roads and kind of bringing the United States kicking and screaming into the 21st century along with the rest of the civilized world kind of thing. Well, to what extent can Joe Biden influence that desired outcome? That is the measure of his power. And so when people are talking with American presidents, for example, you hear people talking about political capital is a term that comes up sometimes. What they're really talking about is a capacity to influence. What leverage do you have that you can bring to bear to influence this outcome? Now, obviously, when you're talking about an elected official, you are constrained, particularly in a system like the United States, which was designed that kind of engineered in countervailing powers. I think I would argue that it is a misnomer to describe the institutional arrangements in the United States as sort of, separate but equal, or co-equal branches of government. They're not co-equal. That's incorrect. And you hear it all the time, usually with someone with a fabulous amount of money spent on how they style their hair, who's sitting in front of a TV camera and doesn't know what they're talking about, okay? That's not right. In other words, the president of the United States, with almost no exception, cannot make law. Only Congress can do that. The courts cannot make law. They can only interpret it, okay? The Congress cannot interpret law. It can design it. It can try to pass it. The Congress cannot enforce law. It can enforce oversight, but it can't enforce law. That's the duty of the executive branch. So these different branches of government in the United States are not intended to be equal. They're intended to be countervailing. One counterbalances another, but they're not equal and they're not intended to be. The House of Representatives is not equal to the Senate. For example, if we negotiate a treaty, I mean, we're getting into kind of political science 202 here, but you'll see where this is going in a minute. If you're talking about negotiating a treaty, the House of Representatives has nothing to do with that. It's the exclusive province of the Senate and the executive branch of government, okay? So they're not equal. The courts typically do not get involved in treaty making. They don't have a role to speak of in diplomacy, okay? So they're not equal. But the idea is that we have these branches of government, these offices that we've developed, and these processes that we use through which people inhabit those offices. Okay, and as a consequence of all that, we have these people rolling around, trying to, I don't know, influence outcomes, right? So, for example, if you are in the United States Senate, you're more likely as an individual actually to have more power than if you're in the House of Representatives. There are simply fewer of you. There are only 100 senators. There are 435 representatives. Okay, but we could also say, well, then the president must be really powerful because there's only one president. Yes and no. There's one president, but when you consider the presidency and the executive branch of government, that's the largest part of government. That's almost all of government. Okay, so what we have to figure out is how do we decide how powerful an office is, or an individual in that office is? What do we look for? We look for their capacity to influence desired outcomes. Okay. The easiest way to do that, and the most certain way of exercising effectively that influence over desired outcomes, is to have some sort of institutional legitimacy. That is, it's not the president that's important. It's the presidency as an office. Donald Trump isn't president anymore. And if he were ignored by the news media right now, we would find that he had remarkably little power. When he was president, also, he had, in many cases, remarkably little power. There were all kinds of things that Donald Trump, the individual, wanted to do that the American system of government would not allow him to do. Part of the problem there was he didn't really at all understand the mechanics of power in politics. He didn't understand how the presidency worked. He didn't understand how elections work. He didn't understand how the legislature works. I mean, he believed all kinds of things about the American political system that simply are not true. And so even though he was an elected president of the United States, he wasn't very powerful in many ways because he didn't know what he was doing a lot of times. Okay. The other thing that hurt him in terms of legitimacy was he never came anywhere near close to winning the popular vote. He didn't win he lost the popular vote by about 3 million in 2016, and he lost it by an even greater margin in 2020. And if you lose elections, normally we think, well, the person who gets the most votes should win. He never got the most votes. It's a sign of what gives him legitimacy. Okay, what we look for in an elected official is, okay, we set up an institution, elections, the outcome of which is to decide who is the legitimate elected official. And the person who loses the election, or the people who lose the election, right, have to accept that outcome and think, well, I think I would have been the better person for that job. Clearly, a lot of other people agreed because they voted for me, but not enough of them voted for me. And that's the way the system works. And so whether I like it or not, the person with the most votes is legitimately elected. Okay, that's an important source of power, institutional legitimacy. Okay, and so the idea of power is the more institutional legitimacy you have, right, the more you are accepted and indeed even supported, because the general consensus is you belong there. The more you enjoy that legitimate authority, the more the accepted institutions that govern our decisions reinforce your right to be there and to have that authority and exercise that authority, the more powerful you are. So the key to exercising political power, political influence, is legitimate authority. Okay. Now that
Professor Hughes.
One second. Because I thought for a second that somebody else's hand went up. Before I get to Jackson, did somebody have their hand up and I missed it? Okay, maybe you changed your mind. Sorry, Jackson, go ahead.
It's just interesting kind of hearing you say and talk about the Trump presidency. And I mean, rightfully so. I guess you're saying he didn't have a lot of technical power within the bounds of his office to carry out certain things. But as far as his power to influence the decision making ideology mindset of people in the country, he seemed to have a tremendous amount of what you could call soft power, cultural sway, in that, you know, we are almost at, you know, nearly 1 million deaths from COVID, and Trump's had a huge amount of power in that he at times made quite a light deal of the virus, or made quite almost discredited the science of climate change and trade deals, and taking us out of the Paris Accords. I mean, they seem to have quite a bit of power in some ways. And I was wondering if you could just kind of talk about Trump's power and his speeches
Sure,
and talking
sure.
and the power of tweets and just
Again,
having that voice. It was a powerful voice.
okay, so I can respond. First of all, remember, you pointed this out yourself, Jackson. The exercises of power are goal-oriented. You're trying to achieve a desired outcome. I don't really believe that the desired outcome of Donald Trump was that almost 1 million people, about 700,000 people, would die of COVID. So in that sense, he did not affect a desired outcome. In other words, there are always consequences to the things you do, but if they're not intended, then they're not exercises in power. Okay, so that's the first thing. We have to be careful about that. Now, more interestingly, though, you bring up this great point about, well, didn't he have a lot of influence over American culture or the popular narrative or any, you know, that kind of thing? I think that's where you were going. Is that right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, imagine Trump being Trump, but Senator McConnell, the majority leader in the Senate, saying, remember before this guy was nominated when I told you he was a clown? He's a clown. Ignore him. If the Republican Party had disavowed Trump, and they could have done, had they cared enough as an institution, they could have withdrawn the legitimacy he had as a Republican, right? And that would have cost him the nomination. The Republican Party gave him that nomination through their own processes. Remember that every prominent Republican, including people who later were sort of on the Trump bandwagon, described him as crazy, as stupid, as a lunatic, and as a fool. Okay. The problem was, you know, they then, when they realized they had nothing better to offer, then they had to rally around him. And so they gave Trump power. He didn't have it. But also, what real desired outcomes did he, for example, all right, you say, well, you know,
The Supreme Court's the biggest thing.
Hold on. He did not decide that. The Senate did. If Democrats had controlled the Senate, the Supreme Court would look completely different. If Mitch McConnell had not prevented the Senate from voting on Merrick Garland when Obama was still president, a year before the election, right? The court would have looked different. That's not Trump. That's Republicans controlling the Senate as much as anything else. So he didn't do that himself. Also, there's no one he put on the court who he wanted on the court. He was given lists by, you know, the Federalist Society and Mitch McConnell and the leadership of the Senate. And they were like, look, choose from this list, Mr. President, and we'll support any of these people. That's not his power. In other words, the key here is desired outcomes. Now, did he have the capacity to break things and, you know, go around and knock the furniture over, you know, politically? And of course he did. But really, to what end? What was he trying to accomplish? Other than, you know, enhancing the likelihood that people were going to pay attention to him as a person, what was he really accomplishing? Because again, if you think, well, you know, he was a Republican, okay, then why did we run up such massive debt? Because that's not a Republican policy. Free trade is a Republican policy. Trump opposed that. And he took American trade policy 50 years back in time or more. Okay, that's, you know, he didn't really know what he was doing. So if you don't know what you're doing, you don't really know what you desire as an outcome, it's hard to describe you as powerful. Now, we can say that there's a lot of effect that you generate, But to the extent that it's, what I'm trying to suggest is, to the extent that it's not goal-oriented and programmatic in some way, where you're actually in control of what you're doing, I would say you can have effect without having power. Because, you know, Donald Trump was also impeached twice. And had it not been for the absolute lockstep support of Republicans, unlike when Richard Nixon was president, Donald Trump would have been the first president to be forcibly removed from office in the history of the country. That's not power. He could have gone to jail. That's not power. The only thing that saved him was Republicans in Congress, a countervailing institution, because they knew that the damage to the Republican Party would be so severe if Donald Trump actually, you know, was ousted from the office. That, because we saw this happen when Richard Nixon was compelled to resign. He would have been the first president removed by force. It was clear. The Republicans, including very conservative Republicans like Barry Goldwater, actually walked over to the White House, sat down and said, Mr. President, it's time to go. Okay. Had the Republicans done that with Trump, he would have had to leave. He would have had to leave. Okay. The other thing about that is, you know, when you look at, we don't know how much of what's being reported about the last 6 months of that presidency is accurate. And a lot of it is probably histrionic garbage. But the fact is that if half of it's true, he was willing to shatter American law in order simply to remain in the presidency. That's the next thing we need to talk about. That was him trying to exercise force. Okay. Now somebody had their hand up. Yes. Where did you go? You keep jumping around.
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know why that does that.
So I was like, just to kind of sum up what you're saying, and or maybe turn some of my own mind of what you're saying, is that the Trump was not, Trump had influence and not power. And the reason he didn't have power is because he wasn't able to achieve desired outcomes, because you really may have not had any. But the legitimacy of his influence was given by institutions that were trusted. And because those trusted institutions had given him that authority figure, then that's like where he wielded his influence from, was from the legitimate institutions rather than his own.
I mean, I don't want to make this a retrospective on the Trump presidency. First of all, it's boring, you know, and it's just boring. But also, I mean, everyone's kind of done the Trump thing already. The point I'm trying to make is that he was given, he allowed for the creation of this illusion of incredible power to be propagated around him. Remember who he admired most? Dictators, right? Well, the thing about dictators is, like a Putin is powerful because he knows exactly what he's doing. He knows exactly what he's doing. He is not Donald Trump. He's the real deal. He's a real regulation, size, and weight dictator. He's a real thug. He's a badass, and he's really smart, and he's very politically knowledgeable. Okay, none of those things apply to Donald Trump politically. Okay, none of them. And you can't, what Trump should have shown people is not any idiot can be president. You actually have to have a skill set. You actually have to have a point. You actually have to have a direction in which you want the country to go. Otherwise, you're ineffective. And when you look at, well, what was Trump really effective at doing that no one else wanted? Think about Franklin Roosevelt trying to influence the outcomes of the New Deal. Okay, he needed Democrats in Congress to do that. It wasn't Roosevelt. He was important in sort of, for want of a better term, selling the policies to the American people. That was what the fireside chats were all about and everything, right? And he was very effective at that. Trump wasn't. Trump never unified the country around anything, never. Now you can say, well, Trump wanted a divided America. Well, Trump didn't get a divided America because we're not nearly as divided as everyone wants us to believe. And that's not because of Trump, okay? So that's not an outcome. Getting us out of a trade deal. Republicans didn't like that trade deal because it was negotiated by Obama. That was the only thing that was considered wrong with it. It was negotiated by Obama, okay? But But that was where he broke with a lot of Republicans. You know, people talk about the evangelical support that Trump had and things like that. Not really. I mean, he split the evangelical vote. It's one of the reasons why he got beaten so badly in the second election. He split the evangelical vote. There were a lot of evangelical, very devout Christians who were like, look, yeah, I mean, maybe better than whatever socialists the Democrats are going to throw out from their point of view, but Trump's a pig, and they didn't vote for him. You know, that is an interesting phenomenon in the 2020 election, because there was ambivalence in 2016. The other thing about the 2016 election that people forget, Donald Trump had the highest negatives of anyone ever running for president from the major parties in the modern era. You know who was second? Hillary Clinton. The highest negatives in history. Okay.
What are negatives?
That is, people had more negative feelings about them than positive feelings. They were underwater in terms of the degree to which people trusted them or liked them or wanted them to win. Okay. I mean, if you took away dyed in blue Democrats, and that's a small number of people in the country, Hillary Clinton had no support at all. Trump had even less. But Trump won because of an institutional glitch that we've had that arguably is a legacy of slavery, which is the Electoral College. But he lost the popular vote twice. And, you know, I mean, that's not a powerful person. A powerful person could have contested those elections more aggressively. Okay. You know, it's been rare in American history that someone who lost the popular vote actually got to be president. It's almost never happened. There's only been a few times. And every time it has done, it has undermined the legitimacy of the president. Okay, when you think about George W. Bush, when he was elected in 2000, he lost the popular vote. But remember that Al Gore, once the courts had sort of intervened and there was this vote counting process, Gore began to see that that process was corrosive of the very institutions that provided legitimacy for the process. And so he conceded. He said, enough's enough. And they stopped the process. Okay. Oddly enough, you know, Gore is still considered to be influential. He's still considered to be a legitimate figure. You know, even though, I don't know, he didn't run a very effective campaign in 2000, you know. But what I'm trying to suggest here is that going out and yelling and name calling and othering and demonizing and everything else, that's what dictators do. And they do it because they don't have a legitimate way to exercise influence. And so they kind of have to lean into the negatives and they have to lean into the fear factor. If you are ruling by terror, most people think, oh, that's incredibly strong. No, it's not. It's really not. That's what I'm suggesting. It makes you and the entire system vulnerable. Okay. Think about the Soviet Union, or worse yet, think about the Third Reich. Think about the Nazis. That was supposed to be a 1,000-year Reich. Okay. It lasted from about 1933 to 1944, a little short of 1,000 years. Hitler's own military leaders were trying to kill him. That's not a sign of power. People were refusing his orders in the field. That's not a sign of power. Germany, remind you, lost the war. That's not a sign of power. Okay. And most people think of Hitler as the ultimate dictator. What I'm trying to suggest is dictatorship is brittle. It will break because it relies on coercion and fear and lies and secrecy and more lies and more secrecy. And this undermines people's trust in the system and their belief that that system is there either to protect them or advance their interests. Ultimately, that will break down. I'm sorry, Karen, you had your hand up and I think I cut you.
I was just going to ask, is it sort of because it's kind of like a management nightmare to be a dictator? There's all these different...
It's a euphemistic way to think of it. It sounds so much more pleasant when we consider it to be a management nightmare, but yes.
Okay.
It's so much more difficult to rule by terror, especially when you're not very terrifying, you know?
Yeah.
If Kim Jong-un had come from nowhere and tried to run North Korea, he wouldn't be able to do it. The only reason he can do it is because he has this totalitarian bureaucracy and military structure behind him that was created ultimately by his grandfather, reinforced by his father. But he sort of totters around like this silly little guy. And, you think, well, is he really powerful? No. The threat of him using nuclear weapons is dangerous. That's not the same thing as him being powerful, because Kim Jong-un, other than staying on people's table, right, staying in the news, there's not a lot he can really affect. His people are starving. And when his military starts to starve, they will kill him. They will eliminate him.
Yeah.
Pascal? Can I ask you, Pascal, your name is hyphenated. How do you like to be referred to?
Yeah, Pascal's totally
That's
fine.
what I thought, but I just want to make sure, because I really, it's annoying when you get people's names wrong. I'm sorry.
No, you're good. That's my name, Pascal. My first name's Pascal Jamot. But so talking about, you said Vladimir Putin's like the real deal and he's like a total badass, and I thought that was funny. But what I was wondering is if you think that someone like Putin, who is like in the place of dictatorship, yields both power and force, or just one or the other, and that's what makes him legitimate.
You see how we can use these tools for analysis? Pascal just did it. Okay, what I'm trying to say is it's not an either or. Someone can be powerful, and clearly Putin is. Remember, however fraudulent the elections, he can kind of claim he won a bunch of elections. And even when he was out of the presidency, he remained a prominent figure until he came back to the presidency. That's because he wasn't just terrifying people. He's very politically skilled. Okay, and he's very wealthy, and he's made himself very wealthy. So he's advanced his personal interests. But the other thing he's done is, at least until recently, he has garnered very powerful popular support in Russia, because he's helped to reinvigorate this notion of greater Russia that was lost with the collapse of the Soviet Union. So you see, actually, Putin did achieve a lot of his outcomes. He had a program when he went into the presidency, which was to restore that notion of greater Russia, to restore the Soviet Union without communism, essentially, to reinvigorate the notion of Russian empire. And he did that very successfully, especially when you consider that other than energy, they export very little that anyone really wants. They have essentially the economy of a developing country, but they've got energy, and he understands that. The problem with that, and this is where the limitation of his power is in many cases, when oil prices fall, Putin becomes more vulnerable, because suddenly then he can't deliver on the domestic promises. We're going to have these programs and do this for you and all that, which he could do when energy prices were high. The same thing with Hugo Chavez when he was presiding over Venezuela. When oil prices were high, he was really effective as a leader because he delivered the goods. He wanted to institute 21st century socialism in Venezuela and demonstrate that it could work. When oil prices were high, the country could afford it. And they opened all kinds of clinics, and their literacy rates went way up, and their healthcare improved dramatically, and all these social indicators improved significantly. Venezuela was looked at, it frightened the United States because it was functionally socialist, but it was looked at as like, this is a country to watch, except for a lot of us saying, what's going to happen when oil prices fall? And then we saw what happened when oil prices fell. The bottom fell out of his whole program. Okay. And suddenly someone who, yes, had been very powerful, very influential, very skilled leader, very effective. He needed that political economy that was disproportionately supported by the global oil price. As soon as that fell, he lost a lot of the sense of legitimacy because he could no longer deliver those programs. Now, somebody asked earlier, is part of Putin's power derived from his past as being in the KGB and having those institutional connections and all that? Absolutely, of course, yes. That's a great point. In other words, he came in with a lot of institutional integrity behind him. He was effective in the KGB. He wasn't just a thug. I mean, he's, again, very smart, a very good analyst of global affairs, for a head of state. And he knew how to make decisions. But a lot of that was, that experience in the KGB. Karen, did you have another question or comment?
Yeah, I was going to ask you, so I work a lot, or I used to work before COVID a lot in Zimbabwe, and Mugabe was the dictator there for quite some time. My question is are you more successful as a dictator if you are operating in a legitimate environment, i.e. Putin was elected versus Mugabe, who just sort of took over? Because I would think that, for instance, like Mugabe he's a constant target to any one of his men who could just shoot him and take over. There's
Well, he's not
no,
now because he's functionally,
well, he's not now, but
yeah.
for a long time, you know, it was really anyone's guess as to how long he was going to be there, just depending on how much he could bribe and pay off his cronies around him to keep him there, like the circle of distrust, versus someone like
Right.
Putin, who's voted in via legitimate,
Well,
you know, maybe
however
dodgy,
legitimate elections.
yeah, dodgy voting election.
Exactly. This is where institutions, and we're going to talk more about institutions on next Tuesday. I just want to make sure that we spend some time on this notion of power and force, because the first thing people think about is, well, wait a minute, dictators are more powerful. In fact, even in that video, the last person I show is Kim Jong-un holding a gun. And I say categorically there, yeah, if you have legitimacy, you're more powerful than that guy. And what I'm saying is kind of what Karen's talking about. Mugabe didn't just grab power, right? He stepped into power through acclamation. He had been a leader in that insurgency. He'd been a leader in the struggles against Ian Smith and the Rhodesian regime. He had acquired legitimacy as a freedom fighter, however symbolic it was, as obviously mythologized and everything else. But he was, and believe me, had tremendous support outside of what became Zimbabwe. I was an undergraduate at the time, and the African Student Union had a huge celebration when Mugabe took power, because he was one of a host of then young, dynamic, battle-hardened leaders who they thought were going to really revolutionize sub-Saharan Africa. So he came in with a tremendous amount of support. There was a tremendous amount of optimism, and then did stand for elections after that, right? He did help to set up, they had a constitution, they had elections, they ran the elections and everything else. Now, by contrast, if you look at Eritrea, when Eritrea finally, after 30 years of war, defeated Ethiopia by making an alliance with an insurgency within Ethiopia that then took power in Ethiopia, right? There was tremendous optimism. Oh, they're going to be the Singapore of sub-Saharan Africa. They've got all this brain power and this incredible energy and organizational skills and all this kind of stuff, and high literacy rates and everything. They're going to be great. The very first act of Isaias Afwerki, when the EPLF became the PFDJ, was to suspend the Constitution. And ever since then, he's been a maximum leader. That country is, after North Korea, the most militarized country in the world. There is absolutely zero political legitimacy. Significant portions of that population are starving. You have people who were promised that they were going to be sort of cashiered from the military and given jobs and everything, that were instead retained in the military without pay. That is rule by force. They were keeping political prisoners in containers and stuff, like little like transportation containers and things. It's a butcher shop, that country, especially compared to what it could have been. Isaias has very little power outside of Eritrea, which is a tiny country. That is not the case when he came to power. But because, again, he pursued almost immediately illegitimate means of staying in power and keeping the core of the EPLF in power, that both he as an individual head of state among the community of heads of state, and Eritrea as a country lost its legitimacy. So now they've been marginalized. This happened with Zimbabwe. There was tremendous potential in Zimbabwe, and most all of it was squandered. Now, there are a lot of reasons for that. It's not like, well, that's because they're stupid. No, there are a lot of reasons why things like that happen. But reasons don't excuse things. They explain them, okay? And what I'm suggesting, again, is when you abandon that notion, first of all, when you abandon the notion of demonstrating legitimate authority, of showing people, hey, I know what I'm doing, and I'm going to give you a chance to give me some feedback on it. We're going to hold an election. When you do that, you see, if you are in fact reelected, you're more powerful. It happens all the time. You have stability issue in a country, and then maybe the military steps in, and then they say, okay, we've stabilized everything, now we're going to have an election. Now, no one's expecting it to be completely free and fair, but the fact that they're holding an election can be significant. Then you look at somebody like, Lukashenko in Belarus. Okay, when he first came to power, he was incredibly popular. Won the election. He was the very first president of Belarus. He's also the only president of Belarus in its history, because they didn't have anything like a democracy prior to that. He's still there, 30 years later, and he's a thug. He's a gangster, and everyone knows it. Everyone knows it. He is ruling by terror. And really, the only thing that really keeps him in power right now, arguably, is Vladimir Putin, because he's essentially Putin's hitman. That's not power, but he uses force in order to get the things to aggrandize himself, to enrich himself and his cronies and things like that. But that's not political power. It doesn't mean that you're weak and feeble. It means you cannot achieve objectives beyond your own self-interest. That's not political power. Again, the Trump example, all he really succeeded in doing on his own was to aggrandize himself. But, everything that we're seeing in American politics right now, the things that led up to January 6th, the reaction against, liberalism and, various notions of sexuality and the myth of a war on religion and all this kind of stuff, all that stuff has been a feature of the American landscape for more than a generation. None of it's new. And none of it was caused by Donald Trump. All Trump really did by his own conduct was to demonstrate, yeah, go ahead, do and say what you want. I have your back. There are some very nice people there. That's not really power, right? Because he was afraid in a way of a lot of his own constituency when you look at some of the things he did. I mean, he was supposed to be the president of fiscal responsibility. And before the election, he just started writing checks for things. That's what dictators do. Okay, it didn't work. It just didn't work. If you have to buy people's support with things like massive farm subsidies that are only necessary because you're in a trade war that's displacing a lot of agricultural economy, that's not power. That's chaos. Okay? Okay, chaos is a ladder. I get it. But you see what I'm saying? In other words, it doesn't mean that you can't affect outcomes. There's just no determination that you can actually get done what you want to get done. Because first of all, it presupposes there's something that you want to accomplish and that you know enough to know, okay, in order to accomplish this, we need to do this and this and this. Okay. The person who has that insight and then is supported by that institutional authority, duly elected, obeying the rule of law, by whatever the standards are that are accepted within that political culture. When you're doing those things, you're always going to be more effective at achieving desired outcomes than when you are flaunting all those things and ignoring them and breaking them. There's just, history screams that. Dictatorships last a long time, except that they don't. I mean, 30 years politically isn't that long a time when you consider that, you got to ask yourself, well, what happened to the country in that 30 years? Was there development? Was there improvement? Was there stability? If there wasn't, then you have to ask, well, is that what that 30-year president desired? 30 years of instability? No, not really. So remember, the key to this is your effectiveness at achieving the outcomes that you want to achieve politically, not just personal enrichment. Okay, all that makes you as an opportunist. That doesn't give you legitimate political power. Again, if I have a gun, I can influence you. Okay, that is, I can scare you into doing something. But it's that sort of management problem Karen was talking about. If I can just persuade you to do something that I want you to do, I'm actually more powerful because it doesn't cost me very much. That means I can do more of it. Okay, if my desired outcome is for you to learn, the most effective way for me to do that is not terrify you by constantly telling you you're going to fail. My most effective way of doing that is to find a way to convince you, first of all, that it's worth your time, right, to try to do well in the class, and that the materials are there for you to do that with relatively small investments of time. If I can do that, that's going to be much more effective than me saying, well, I'll just flunk all of you. I've had professors who were like that. They were, usually these old fossils who've been there too long, and they had their little structures, and they were, the same notes for 20 years and everything else. And they would have, certain guidelines for things. And even though their effectiveness as educators was clearly eroding, they would just flunk people. That's not powerful in the sense of, I don't think his desired outcome, that I'm thinking of one in particular, was to flunk lots of students, or to have a lot of those students go to the dean with grievances. That doesn't seem like a desired outcome. And yet, he was tenured, right? Had all this experience behind him, had a certain amount of expertise, but was not effective in the classroom, and so not powerful. That's what I'm trying to suggest. Now, force is used in politics all the time. It really is, but it's not as reliably effective as the kind of influence that comes from having institutional authority behind you, having legitimacy, having people, well, I don't really agree with what they're doing, but A, there's not a lot I can do about it. B, it's the president. The president says that, or if Congress says that, if a police officer says that, we kind of have to do it, if that is the rule of law, okay? That's always going to give you more authority. The most powerful police officers are the ones that never use their firearms. The most effective are the ones that never take that service revolver out unless they're practicing. There's no question of that. I say that knowing a lot of police officers, and they say that, if you have, I remember a couple of older cops I know in particular, when they retired, one of the things I got tired of hearing was about some young cop who would go home and, tell the family about taking out that service revolver, popping off a couple of caps. And it's like, that's not being a police officer. Police officers are not soldiers. We're not the enemy. They're supposed to protect us, okay? To the extent that they do, we will do what they ask them to do, even if we don't want to. I don't want a ticket, but if you're not going to shoot me, and if, yes, indeed, I went through the stop sign or whatever, then you're going to, it's like, okay, you're right. You got me. But if you pull a gun on me, you're going to piss me off. And by the way, I know that's true because I had a cop do it. And all it did was piss me off. It's a funny story, but I don't want to waste your time. But I realized after the fact, what if that guy shot me? And it was like in that moment, I didn't really care. It was like, you're going to have to shoot me because you're an asshole, I was on the grounds crew at Cal State Chico when I was a student. And in the wintertime, it was still dark when I went to work because I had to be on the job at 6 a.m. And I had to walk this area and kind of make sure, pick it up and stuff. There were like old broken down frat houses and stuff there. And, there was always like beer and passed out people and stuff like that. Or if there's a storm, there might be limbs down and things like that I had to be aware of. And it was kind of foggy. I'm walking along and I can see someone, how in fog in the early morning, you can kind of see someone like they'll walk by a light, they'll just kind of glow, but you can't really see what they are. And I didn't think much about it because, I'm 10,000 miles away, it's quiet. Next thing I know, I hear somebody say something really authoritatively to me. And I realize, I'm that far away. This guy's rolled up on me and pulled his gun on me. Now, all I see is a guy with a gun, right? And I said something colorful, and he finally identified himself as a police officer. And I said, well, I'm not, I said, I'm busy. You pull that piece on me, you better use it because, and it was a stupid thing to do. But again, you see what I'm saying? It made me mad. Whereas if he'd come up on me and said, excuse me, sir, can I ask what you're doing here? I'd have been like, oh yeah, here I would have showed him my student ID, I work on the grounds crew. See, everything would have been fine if he had not looked at me as the enemy. But as soon as he pulled that service revolver, what ultimately happened was he was reported for that because, my foreman came up behind me and he was a very frightening man and just started to lean into this cop. I thought he was going to beat the crap out of him. And he said, give me your, he actually said, give me your badge. See, that's the thing. We won't take that. Not beyond a certain point. Well, we won't do it with a dictator either. That's just a cop trying to act like a dictator. That's not a cop trying to act like a police officer. That's a cop who's an asshole. Well, there are heads of state, there are senators, there are representatives who are assholes. They make fools of themselves. They get arrogant. They break the law. They take campaign money and they use it for personal expenses. They're corrupt. They're advancing their own interests. They're creeps. Whatever it is, we will go after them. Yeah, Pascal.
So if power is the ability to influence a specific outcome, and say you're a political opportunist like a dictator, and your like desired outcome really is just to enrich yourself by taking like a specific office, in a way, would they then be considered to have power because their outcome that they desired was just to enrich themselves?
No,
so in that way, do they have power?
Under the model I'm advancing here, that would not be a political outcome. That would be a personal outcome. That is, it would be corruption. One of the things I mentioned in the notes on politics is that if you use political institutions or political authority to enrich yourself personally, that is the definition of corruption. Okay, so it doesn't mean you can't be corrupt. It means you cannot be politically effective. So that if you're just trying to win offices, and everyone knows it, because usually they can tell, you're not liable to be very effective in a legislature. And there are a lot of people who get elected to a state legislature, or they get elected to the House. Rarely you'll find someone like that in the Senate. And they're not effective because everyone knows it's like they don't get good committee assignments because they're flakes. They don't know what they're doing, and they make fools of themselves, and they embarrass the party who they're supposed to represent, right? And so they're not powerful. Now, they might be advantaged personally, but that's not a political outcome. So what we're talking about here, remember, this is a class in politics and power. So yeah, personally, did Donald Trump benefit personally from being president of the United States? Clearly. Was he effective politically? No. Not nearly as much as was Barack Obama, or even so far as was Joe Biden. Now, Joe Biden has not been terribly effective, but his initial goals were relatively limited. Now he's kind of opening it up a little bit, saying, yeah, we want this major infrastructure thing. We want to join the rest of the civilized world in the 21st century. Okay. It's an open question as to how effective he and the Democrats will be at doing that. Okay. But they do have legitimacy going forward. Most of that infrastructure program, when you look at the individual pieces, has majority support within the electorate. The problem is it's also incredibly expensive as an investment. And that scares a lot of people because we're already, we're talking right now about raising the debt ceiling. What a lot of people don't understand about that is we're not raising the debt ceiling so that we can fund the government going forward. We're raising the debt ceiling to pay for the debt we accumulated prior to this. Well, a lot of that debt was accumulated under 2 terms of Obama trying to buy us out of a recession, which America has done several times in its history, and also the massive tax cuts and the other kinds of transfers that were engineered by the Trump administration, usually for, to try to help him win the election. Like I say, the expanding the farm subsidies and things like that, extended unemployment benefits, things, by the way, that in many cases Trump did not support, but Congress did. So the challenge there is political effectiveness. If this would be a different kind of class if we were just trying to decide, well, can you use political office to make yourself rich or to make yourself famous? That's different. I guess it would be like an actor who made really crummy comedies or action movies or something, was never taken seriously as an actor and never won an Academy Award or anything like that, but made lots of money. Have they really advanced the art? No, but they made themselves rich. Do we then consider them a great actor? Not usually. Powerful as an actor? No. Effective at making lots of money? Yes. You can look at politicians in much the same way, because let's face it, there's a lot of performance associated with being a politician. Okay. Now, again, as with everything that we talk about, I'm not saying this is the only way to look at this. The reason why I developed, partly, I think it can reveal things that other models of politics and power don't reveal. But If you aren't comfortable with this model, that's fine, as long as you understand the model. And then if you understand the model and understand that what I'm not talking about, this was Pascal's point, I'm not talking about personal aggrandizement or benefit. I'm talking about public outcomes. Okay. As long as you understand the model, if you then think, well, I can think of examples where that doesn't work, that's good. All you're doing is demonstrating to me that you understand the model. No model explains everything. Okay. But the main thing is to understand, the importance of the distinction between people who exercise power and people who don't have that ability, and so just rip things out from people. Was Al Capone as a gangster really powerful if just because he didn't do his taxes right, he ended up going to Alcatraz? That doesn't sound like a very powerful guy. Now, was he scary? Yeah, he was. Where does power come from? Taking care of the people in the neighborhoods where he lived. He had to give the public something so they would protect him. Most of the really powerful gangsters were powerful because they did that. So they were perceived as legitimate. Well, Mr. Capone said I could have a job. I couldn't have a job. Mr. Capone gave me a job. He gave me a car, this beautiful automobile. All I had to do was kill that guy. What's not to like, right? That's a kind of power. It's like, okay, I had to do something. I had to give you something to demonstrate to you, yeah, you can depend on me. Once I demonstrated that, you don't even have to be afraid of me. You respect me. But also, you probably want me to be in power because I gave you a job, or I gave you a car, or whatever. Bryce, you have a hand up.
Yes, sir. I was wondering if you could give us an example, because we've been mostly focusing on people that don't have legitimate power, of somebody that you would say has legitimate power.
Nancy Pelosi.
In history.
Nancy Pelosi.
Nancy Pelosi. Thank you.
Speaker of the House. She's in the line of succession to the White House. No one really meaningfully questions her legitimacy to exercise the power she does in the House of Representatives. But also, Nancy Pelosi understands that her power does not extend beyond the House of Representatives. She understands that very clearly. She has been able to absolutely herd cats with the Democratic Party, because you got a lot of Democrats running in a lot of different directions right now. It's not just progressives and moderates. You got Democrats going all over the place. You know why? Because it's a very inclusive party. Okay. By contrast, the Republicans, the one thing Trump did do was give the Republicans a figure to rally around. It's just that it's a toxic figure. It's going to hurt the Republicans worse than Richard Nixon did. The evidence of that is already coming in. Now, having said that, here's the paradoxical thing. Because of the way party politics work, there's every likelihood that even though most Americans perceived the Democratic Party right now as somewhat more legitimate than the Republicans, because of the way elections are structured, could very well take control of the House and the Senate in the next round of off-year elections. So but again, the question is not, can they win election? It's, can they govern? It's not, a lot of us think that all politics is elections and campaigns. It's not. Most of politics isn't the campaign. It's governing. And the challenge is, can you govern? Republicans in Congress have not shown a lot of ability to do that because they've been a minority party in the country since the 1930s. So it's kind of hard. They don't have a lot of leverage. The Democrats, rather, were the last majority party that the country knew, and that ended in the late 1970s. We don't have a majority party. But the challenge for Republicans right now in terms of legitimacy is a majority of Americans are not Republicans. They're either some sort of independent or third-party candidate, that's the largest cohort, or about a third of them are Democrats. But slightly less than 30% of voting Americans, or Americans who registered, right, are Republican. You'd never know that, the way the news is covered, or the way, when you look at who holds offices, Republicans have actually done pretty well at working the system. But the fact is, they are a minority party. And in terms of their policies, in terms of, the things that are at the core of the Republican Party, the very simple fact is that every bit of survey data available would suggest that most of what the party wants, most Americans don't want. They want something else. The problem is that Democrats don't, in terms of popularity, don't offer a lot more. That's different from us being polarized. What it means is that we have relatively ineffective leadership. And we may, in fact, have a leadership that's more interested in force than power. We may have a leadership in terms of not only our political leadership, but our business or corporate leadership as well, that's simply focused on the accumulation of a personal capacity to get what we want personally. You know, does Mitch McConnell just want to be, you know, the majority leader in the Senate? Well, if he's going to be, he has to have a majority in the Senate. Is that what he cares about most? Or is there a sense that, no, Mitch McConnell has a vision for the country? I think there are a lot of people who don't know the answer to that question. So that makes people less likely to trust him. Whether they should or not, it makes them less likely to, because it's like, well, what does this guy want? Or what does Nancy Pelosi really want? Does she just want Democrats to rule the world, or is she actually trying to fix the country? And we're unsure about a lot of that because we don't trust politicians. That's fine. But what's risky is we no longer really seem as a people to trust political processes. The institutions themselves have become vulnerable to critique. Okay, and that's where I kind of want to leave it, because the most significant effect of the last 4 years has been to increase really dramatically the level of distrust in the simplest things like election results. Historically, Americans never questioned election results. I would remind you that we held elections during the Civil War. As bad, as difficult as elections were to hold, and as disruptive a time as that was, far more so than now. We held elections, okay? We had a contested election, you know, but nothing like what we're seeing now, where you have widespread distrust in election processes. The majority of Americans do not believe that election fraud is real. They don't, because they understand that there's just no evidence of that. But enough people do that it compromises the ability of people to rely on elections to ensure the kind of legitimate authority that normally yields usable political power. So this is why we could very well be in a kind of political crisis, not only in the United States, but in other parts of the world as well. This isn't just happening in the United States. It's why we're seeing the rise of, you know, right-wing nationalist movements all over Europe, for example, is that people don't trust the existing system anymore. They don't see it, enough of them don't see it as legitimate, that they will go to radical extremes, usually on the right. Right. All right, so what I'd like you to do is two things. One, obviously, complete and submit that assignment by 11 o'clock tomorrow night. But then I'd like you to look at the notes for Module 2, look at the distinction between power and force, and then look at the section before we meet next week. Just glance at the brief section where we talk about what institutions are and why they're important. Because that's the other side of this equation, is institutions, okay? Any questions? Again, let me remind you, I'm not trying to convince you that this is the only way to look at things or that there aren't other ways to analyze power. This one, to me, though, is something I developed in graduate school, and it just seemed to help me see things. It was like getting that, finally, that good pair of glasses that you can really see well with. And it's not perfect, but it seems to me to explain a lot of things that other models of politics don't explain as well.
When you say this one, what are you referring to specifically?
Well, the notion of power and force based on, you know, the distinction being legitimate authority. You know, most people, you know, most of the time are not going to agree that, you know, a president in a system of countervailing powers is actually more powerful than a thug in a dictatorship. But you know, I'm trying to explain why ultimately that is the case, because it's not about a personal individual. It's about institutional integrity and the perpetuating of power and authority as that goes forward. If you lose legitimacy, then you're just a criminal syndicate, you know. And we may see a lot of that in the next generation. Who knows? All right. Anything else?
Maybe this is more of a comment than is a question, but you're talking about like power being derived from like legitimacy, and if not, you're just like a yeah. I mean, I guess it is more of like an open-ended question, but I'm just thinking like, isn't that kind of what just happened in the last election cycle? Like the undermining of the legitimacy of the election process? Isn't that like,
Well, but the fact is that the person most interested in undermining the legitimacy of that election is not president.
oh yeah, I'm also not saying that that is what happened, but what I'm asking is not like literally what Trump did, like he undermined the election system, because I feel like
Well,
now
the
there is
problem
like
is
way
he
more
couldn't,
skepticism.
again, he could not have done that by himself. It was only when, particularly on January 6th, when Republicans in Congress were, for the first time in American history, going to vote to decertify an election. That has never happened. That wasn't Trump. That was Republicans, because it was more important for that party to be able to taint a Democratic victory, even at the cost of destabilizing institutional integrity. I mean, this is a fact on the ground. This is not an opinion, okay? There isn't any other way I can think of to explain that. There's no evidence. Remember that Mitch McConnell himself said, Trump's own Attorney General Bill Barr said, there's no evidence of the kind of voter fraud that would have affected the outcome of this election. And in every one of these so-called audits, what we've actually turned up is not, aha, look, voter fraud. We've turned up more votes for Biden. Okay, so you make a claim that you know is false. And more importantly, people in the Senate, people in the House, people in state legislatures pick that up and hang on to it, not because they believe it's true, but because they can use it for the advantage, not of the country, but of their political party. This is where you have to remember that the two political parties are not government. They're private organizations trying to control government. And if you think about political parties in that way, private, relatively minimally regulated organizations trying to control the entire government, okay, then it makes sense that they would do something like pick up something as stupid as the lies about election fraud. And understand, those are not mistakes. Those are lies. They're not true. They're just not, okay? And again, this is not me expressing opinion. I got opinions on that, but that's not what I teach. But the idea is, I'm trying to explain is why that's dangerous, because to the degree that it undermines the only institution we have by which to either demonstrate or withhold consent, elections, it compromises the legitimacy of the entire political system, because it's all supposed to derive from the outcome of elections. If the legitimacy of elections is in dispute, the entire government becomes illegitimate. So that's the concern about it. That's why it's important. It has nothing to do with Donald Trump. It has everything to do with what was already the fragile legitimacy of elections. The disputed election of 2000 started a lot of this, and it's not really gone away.
I guess actually this may have been more so what my question was leaning towards, and now after you said that, I'm like able to think about it more. I guess my real question is what do you foresee, like just like as someone who's well educated, that future implications of what Trump and the Republicans did to undermine the electoral system? Like, what do you see as like the ramifications for that in the future?
Well, one of them is that the United States will cease to function as a republic. That the democratic components of the republic will be fake. They'll be fraudulent. They really will be fake, because the idea will be, you already saw this happening with the recall election in California, where even before the vote was held, you had Republicans who wanted Newsom out and wanted to replace him, saying this is going to be a rigged election. Well, all Democrats are going to have to face that now. That Republicans now, with any election they lose, their first go-to is going to be, this is a rigged election. If and they've shown that at least for hardcore Republicans and the politically naive, which is a critical mass of the electorate, not a majority, but a critical mass, they'll buy that because they don't know any better. They just don't know any. A lot of the base of Trump's support was people who are not terribly well educated, but more importantly, know very little about American politics and American law. And those are the people most likely to support, these mythic notions and conspiracy theories about the elections and, all this other nonsense. There's always been that element in American life, adults who behave like children, essentially. They're always going to be there. Remember that The overwhelming majority of American adults do not have a university education. There is value in a university education. Okay, it is, but you immediately assume a kind of elite status in the United States. Not even a third of American adults have a university degree. That's, that's low in the single most powerful country on the planet. Okay, that's dangerous, especially when we know that one of the things that university educated people tend to develop is much more of a sense of a bigger world, a more complex world, and a world in which a lot of things they disagree with need to be tolerated. But if you stop at 8th grade or high school or whatever, you're less likely to get that memo. And so when someone presents to you a kind of a conspiracy of intolerance or a conspiracy of gangsterism or something like that, you're much more likely to accept it. It's, again, when you look at the people who are most likely to believe, not to be uncertain about, COVID or about vaccines, but who are going to believe conspiracy theories, it's going to be the least well-educated, the least knowledgeable, the most naive about adult life are the ones most likely to believe those things. The people who think the most like children. And I don't mean stupid, I mean naive, unworldly. It's easier to convince those people. If it wasn't, I would have gotten my head torn off 500 times over in the neighborhoods I lived in when I was a kid. But I figured out very early on, you know what? They don't know that much. I can fill in the blanks. I can convince them of something that ain't true, and I'm not going to get stabbed. Isn't that cool? I mean, you do learn, if you ever wonder why I went into this kind of study and behavioralism and stuff like that, because I saw the way people behaved at their worst. And then I realized there are actually ways to manage that. It's fascinating. It really is. It really is. I'm sure some of you have been in the same situations, grown up in those same neighborhoods. All right, so take a look at the notes. Remember, I'm more than happy to take these questions, and I'm not trying to be absolutist about this, but I'm kind of going to stick to my guns in terms of this is the way I analyze politics. It's just sort of full disclosure. We're going to talk about a lot more than this, but all I'm really asking you to do is consider the importance of legitimacy as a concept, and consider as the most important source of legitimacy to be institutions. And we'll talk about what we mean by institutions and why that's important in the next class, okay? My regular scheduled office hour is noon to 1, but I'm happy to meet with you at other times. I mean, on Mondays, I probably will be on campus from, my first class is at 10:30, so I'll probably be there from about 10 until noon. If I have a house to live in, I'll be in some sort of an office. And then I've got another class at 1:30 on Monday. On Tuesdays, I don't have a class until 1:30, so I'll probably have my office hour at home. Might move it earlier. We might move it from 11 to noon or 11:30 to 12:30, or I can still do noon to 1 and then walk into campus. I'm real close to campus. It just Zoom seems to work easier. It seems to work better for everybody. But if you feel the need to meet with me personally, we can fix that up. We can do that. Okay. All right. Remember, assignment due tomorrow night, 11 o'clock. Otherwise, I guess we'll meet in Taylor Hall next week. Okay.
Awesome.
Gonna be weird. All right. Have a good week.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, Professor.